This is a video commentary of Act 5 of the Duchess of Malfi. Okay, thinking about Act 5s of tragedies, try to think of them in terms of them following the usual patterns of conventions that Act 5s usually have. So we will expect characters, both good and bad, to be coming to some degree of self-knowledge at the end of the play. There'll be some commentary on the world, the unfairness of the world. People, whether they've suffered from madness or they've lost their identity, start to regain their identity, but it comes too late. That's the nature of tragedy. We'll be looking at whether there is restoration of order at the end of the play, or whether Webster sort of questions this notion of a new beginning. Act 5s, we also get these kind of references to fate and that we are just the playthings of the gods. And we should also remember how Act 5s have a sense of natural justice, if not in this world, in the next world. So there's always a sense of kind of a heavenly justice for the virtuous and a hellish punishment for those who are not virtuous. So in that sense, tragedies are quite conservative and quite moral, even though immoral things happen within them. And in that respect, they're like comedies, but comedies end in marriage and tragedies end in tragedy and death. We'll be looking at how what role ghosts seem to play in tragedies. They seem to sort of pop up in many of Shakespeare's tragedies as well. And we'll be looking at this idea of revenge plays being didactic, i.e. didactic, that means they teach us something. And if they teach us something, what is it that they're teaching? And here's some examples of some things that you might consider in terms of the didactic message of the plays. Act 5 starts with reference to the Cardinal's mistress, Julia, and we should consider the character of Julia in the play. If you get a question about women, Julia's character is one in which there's ambiguity about how Webster is presenting her. She can be on one level a victim of the Cardinal who made her fall in love with him, and even though yes, she betrays her husband, she does genuinely fall in love with the Cardinal. However, in Act 5, we see her instant attraction to Bosola as well, which is maybe muddies the water a little bit about how we see her. We see Antonio declare that he's going to go seeking out the Cardinal's chamber, intending to visit him, as once his brother did our Duchess. Now, is he going to plead for his life? Is he going to plead, or is it a kind of action of revenge? I think at this stage, he's hoping that he can sort things out. Which is rather naive. Okay, scene 2 is where the action really gets going. We've got to contend with Ferdinand's insanity, Julia's death, and Bosola's soliloquy about the world, and we look at those in stages. On the right, you've got a picture of Lady Macbeth, and the didactic message of tragedies is that those who set out on a course of murder or revenge are kind of morally poisoned by their actions, and that it comes back to haunt them in Act 5, and they usually sort of the victims of their own vengeance or murderous desires. And so we see that with the Doctor talking about Ferdinand. Are you out of your princely wits? He's haunted by his own shadow. Again, the suggestion is that his conscience is starting to work on him. And there's lots of references to hell with both Ferdinand and his brother. Even Bosola refers to him as what a fatal judgment have fallen upon Ferdinand. So we're seeing the beginnings of judgment, be it the judgment of fate, the judgment of God, or just the workings of the frameworks of tragedies in which people must be punished for their sins. And that leads us to the Cardinal. The Cardinal has to go into this long-winded story about how their family is haunted by the shape of an old woman, and that when she's seen, it means that a member of the family dies. So the Cardinal in saying I must feign somewhat, is pretending to make an excuse for Ferdinand's madness. And I suppose that's keeping in the theme of people pretending to be what they're not, i.e. he's pretending to be as this holy character, but he's not. This play is built up on lies and the difference between appearance and reality. However, Bosola can see through all of this. You know, this fellow doth breed basilics in his eyes. He's nothing but murder. So even the paid assassin casts a judgment on the cardinal as the personification of murder. So again, the idea of Act 5 is judgments are being put down onto people for their actions. Right, Act 5, Scene 2 also continues the presentation of Julia. Okay, if we've had some sympathy for her in how she was treated by the cardinal in Act 4, in Act 5 it becomes a little bit more ambiguous. Instantly she's attracted to Bosola. She says, you know, with your form and my eyes together, you'll find my love is no great miracle. So she's instantly attracted to him. And she's not, in some ways, she's kind of refreshingly honest. She's not going to pretend with some nice modesty that troubles ladies, that ladies have to be haunted by their reputation. She's going to say it as it is. So maybe there's something quite modern and maybe attractive about her as well. Had you been under my chamber window, I should have courted you. Perhaps in Julia, we're reminded of the Duchess who courts Antonio, and the idea of these strong women who refuse to be just seen as alabaster, but are in touch with their femininity, and they're going to get their man. Okay. Webster is interested in presentations of strong women, as we see in Vittoria in The White Devil. But what's also interesting, and I'm mindful of how you might get a question about women in the exam. It's a very popular choice, right? That look at how the men use women as well. Bosola says, I will work upon this creature. He knows how, she's attracted to him and he's going to use her for his own ends. The cardinal is fed up with her and he wants to be quit of her. But he's going to kill her as well. So Julia is both honest and also dishonest at the end. She says, I have betrayed your counsel. Once the cardinal tells her that he has killed the Duchess of Malfi, and he says, look, I'm going to ask you to swear on this book, on the Bible, which she does, and then she's poisoned for it. But in being poisoned for it, she also shows that she's betrayed him to Bosola. So again, she's both victim of the corruption of this cardinal, and yet Webster's also reinforcing that women can't be trusted. She instantly aligns herself to Bosola and betrays the cardinal to him. But I think ultimately our criticism is not with Julia, but it's with the cardinal, that he uses the Holy Bible as the murder weapon. It's only symbolic of the corruption of this cardinal, and to a Protestant audience, confirming the corruption of the Catholic Church to this British audience. And so you should always bear in mind that religious context of how European Italian Catholics and the Catholic Church is being presented on stage to a largely Protestant audience. Okay, let's continue with Act 5, Scene 2. It's quite a long scene, and it ends on Bosola's speech, his soliloquy. And we know in soliloquies in Act 5 that usually about either a commentary on the world, or it's like self-knowledge, or also it can also still be my intention, my plan is. And we see that Bosola asks questions. And he says, shall I suit a fortune any longer? 'Tis a fool's pilgrimage. So this is quite common in tragedies. You get these references to fate, and that humans struggle for 4 acts to sort of control their world, or to being consumed by pride. And in Act 5, they realise that we really are just small things and playthings of the gods, of fate, of destiny. So you always get these references to these abstract nouns, God, fate, and destiny. Perhaps that's reflected by this idea of Fortuna spinning the wheel of fate in Boccaccio's The Fates of Famous Men. And tragedies are often commentaries on life and commentaries about how we are the playthings of the gods. 'Tis a fool's pilgrimage to try to appeal to fortune, says Bosola. Bosola then goes on, because it's a soliloquy, we must trust him when he says, well, good Antonio, I'll seek out thee out, and all my care shall be to put you into safety. So at the end of the play, perhaps we can safely assume that Bosola's on the side of Antonio. He's not being deceptive, and he's going to join him in just revenge. But as we know, anyone who sets out in revenge in tragedies is going to be poisoned by their own aims, if you like. He who sets out for revenge is best to dig two graves. You know, the man who sets out in revenge before giving his cup of poison to someone else is going to taste it himself. This is always the kind of didactic message of revenge. But what has caused Bosola to become an ally of Antonio? He says, still methinks the Duchess haunts me. In many ways, the Duchess is still alive in these characters. What she's done is she's pricked the conscience of Bosola, and so she's turned Bosola good. Okay, and we've seen that transformation in how she met her heroic end. Bosola decides to do good deeds. You can look at my previous commentary on that to find the quotes that she uses. And so that sense of being haunted by what he's done, personified by the Duchess, is making him do good deeds. Perhaps Bosola is the hero of the play, but perhaps he's found his true identity as not a malcontent, but someone who's going to try and right wrongs. And he finishes by saying, O penitence, let me truly taste thy cup, that throws men down only to raise them up. This seems like a very explicitly Christian thing to be saying for someone who has been quite immoral during the play. Okay, he's looking for penitence. Has he found redemption through the death of the Duchess? Is something that we could possibly consider. And he's looking for penitence here. And so the play is starting to take on a very Christian framework of sin leading to punishment and penance, and then to forgiveness and salvation. Whether he gets it or not is a different matter. Right, scene 3 is a very short scene in which Antonio hears the echo of a voice repeating his very words. The suggestion is the echo is the voice of his wife. I can't remember what she says. He says his last line is "my dear wife," and he said the echo says "I, wife's voice." So we're getting the sense of perhaps this echo being the ghost of the Duchess. And we're on the subject of ghosts. Here we see the ghost of Hamlet's father warning him about his uncle, and perhaps telling him what to do. And we see that perhaps with "Oh, fly your fate," says the echo, or the voice of the ghost of the Duchess. But in tragedies, one thing the audience learn is that we can't fly our fate. Our destiny is predetermined, and what this is doing is perhaps heightening the tension of the climax that we're going to see in the next scenes. And it's foreshadowing the eventual death of Antonio and the other characters. But it leaves Antonio determined that he's going to set out for revenge. His life is meaningless now without his wife and children. So, well, let's talk about ghosts a little further. So, this idea of ghosts in tragedies, first of all, why do we have them? You know, why do we have so many ghosts in tragedies? The ghost of Banquo at Macbeth's banquet, the ghost of Hamlet's father, the suggestion of the ghost of the Duchess of Malfi. Ghosts were believed to inhabit that kind of liminal area of purgatory. They were neither in heaven or in hell, and their souls are dwelling in a place suggesting to an audience perhaps that there's unfinished business, perhaps on earth, before they go on to their final journey. And so again, it's heightening the suspense for the audience that these troubled spirits have to be put at rest, and so there's a degree of revenge still needed to be undertaken before they can be at peace. And this idea of people in limbo, in purgatory, has kind of intrigued artists throughout the centuries. And here's an example of Hieronymus Bosch imagining Jesus in limbo, in a world of purgatory, and people in a state of punishment before their final sentence of either salvation, but in this case it looks like hell and punishment. Okay, Act 5, Scene 4 relies on mistaken identity on stage, and we also get this sense of a kind of heavenly justice. If we don't get justice on earth, playwrights are showing us that there's kind of heavenly justice in the afterlife. Okay, for this to work, this play can only work really in terms of it being lit on stage in darkness with slivers of light, and that's why we've got a picture of a lantern there. Okay, it doesn't work so well on a bright globe stage in which people are mistaking someone else's identity. But I suppose the nature of the play being performed inside has shaped the drama. Bosola, in trying to seek to defend and ally himself to Antonio, accidentally kills the man he would have saved above my own life. So, thinking it's the cardinal, he wounds Antonio by mistake. So it can only work. We have to suspend our disbelief. And again, it's that nature of light and dark at work in this play. And then in Antonio dying, Bosola says, this is his act of mercy. I'll whisper a thing in his dying ear, so I'll make his heart break quickly. Thy fair Duchess and 2 sweet children are murdered, and Antonio dies with a broken heart. So he's trying to put him out of his misery. So Bosola, who's gone through the whole play being deceptive, is now telling people the truth. And it reminds us also of when Bosola said his last words to the Duchess before she died. And he said that her husband and children are alive, and so he lies in a way to sort of preserve her. And here he's telling the truth in order to make Antonio die. So we're constantly being asked to see a character who plays with truth and lies throughout the play, and maybe his identity has now been restored. He's telling the truth in a world in which he's been paid to tell lies all the time as a malcontent. So it's kind of interesting. So in a sense, we're looking now at this idea of the deaths that people get. In many ways, Antonio welcomes death because he knows he's going to be with his wife and kids. And so in some ways we could regard this as a good death. There's heavenly justice even though he dies. So let's consider this idea of heavenly justice further. Act 5, we're looking at the last lines of characters, and it's well worth learning by heart some of the last lines of characters. The cardinal enters Act 5 puzzled in a question about hell. Again, he's pondering on his destiny, and he says how tedious it is to have a guilty conscience. Is he dismissing the idea of conscience here? He knows he's going to hell, and as we know in tragedies, we cannot avoid our destiny. Then he's injured by Bosola, and he cries out for help. But Rodrigo has already been told by the cardinal that the cardinal will put on an act of asking for help, but just ignore it. And so Rodrigo says, fie upon his counterfeiting. He doesn't believe the cries for help when they're really true. And in a way, this continues this theme of appearance versus reality, that this character built on lies is when he's telling the truth, no one's going to believe him for his counterfeiting. And of course, Bosola says this of him: now it seems thy greatness was only outward. Okay, the whole theme of tragedies is that people are restored to who they really are. And the pride and arrogance of the cardinal is merely a shell. And even the cardinal has to acknowledge the justice, this heavenly justice at the end. And his last lines are this: I suffer now for what former have been. Sorrow is held the eldest child of sin. So this idea of sorrow being personified as the child of sin shows that we are, we will be punished for what we do wrong, and that the message, the didactic message, is you cannot escape your punishment for your sins. So it's a very kind of orthodox Christian framework that this tragedy is set within. I've put a picture here of an image of, I think it's Dr. Faustus, and he's looking at all his magic, and there's the devil behind him, Mephistopheles. And why I'm reminded of Dr. Faustus with the cardinal is that in some ways the cardinal doesn't believe he can be forgiven. He doesn't attempt it. In questioning about hell, he doesn't, this cardinal, this holy man, doesn't seek God's forgiveness. And that's really important, because the audience know, therefore, that he's going to die unforgiven and without grace, and so he will go to hell. In the same way, Dr. Faustus, his pride leads him down this road of magic. And they both share this idea of pride. And at the end, his pride stops him from feeling he can be forgiven. So Faustus is dragged down to hell because of his own despair. He doesn't think that he's worthy of God's forgiveness. The cardinal doesn't seek God's forgiveness, and so both characters are going to hell. And so we've got this natural sense of justice. Again, the evil characters are definitely going to hell. So traditionally, Act 5, Scene 5s of tragedies, we're focusing on the last words of characters. In many ways, they sum up some of the themes of the play, and they sum up the didactic messages further. Right? So Bosola, fatally wounding Ferdinand, and remember, Ferdinand fatally wounds his own brother as well. Bosola says he seems to come to himself, so now he's so near the bottom. So we've got that sense of people are restored to their true identity. He comes out of madness, but only at the very end. And Ferdinand, the first out of madness, he recognises his what he's done. My sister, that's the cause of it. He's acknowledging what he's done. And I think this is quite true of tragedies, is that characters are given that space. They're killed in such a way that they have a mortal wound, but then, they're allowed these dying moments. And that's really important in tragedies. It's a convention that, they're not slit in the throat. They have these last lines. And here we might possibly interpret this as a moment of redemption. Whether we fall by ambition, blood, or lust, like diamonds we are cut with our own dust. So again, like his brother, he says, we are the cause of our own downfall. And these rhyming couplets, lust and dust, are supposed to sort of hook us in and make the audience remember these key moments, these key conclusions. We are the result of our own demise. Okay, and it's debatable whether the audience see this as in some way redemption for Ferdinand or not. But he's acknowledging his own sins, and so maybe you can see this as some form of confession. But it's interesting what Bosola's last lines are. Bosola says, let worthy minds never stagger in distrust, to suffer death or shame for what is just. He's learning that we should, whether we die or suffer shame, we should do the right thing. He says, so he's learned something as well about we should do the right thing, whatever the consequences. We should aim to do what is just. So he's gained a new sense of identity. But it's interesting that he says, mine is another voyage. And I'm reminded perhaps of this image of the river Styx and Charon, who takes people across the river to the underworld in the classical illusion. And this idea that I think Bosola is thinking he's on that destination there, he's going to the underworld. And it forces the audience to think about our own lives and what we do. So there's a very kind of redemptive passage open for the audience. Remember that a Jacobean audience, it would be very important to have a good death. And a good death meant that you were forgiven for your sins before dying, so that you were ensuring you were going to heaven and receiving God's grace. But here, rather like Faustus, Bosola thinks he's going on another journey. So I think last lines are very important to consider in tragedies. And so we get to the very end of the play. We're left with Delio, with Antonio's son, join all our force to establish this young hopeful gentleman in his mother's right. So again, this idea that the play is seeking to restore the broken world. And it's trying to restore the order of succession, like Antonio's son is to be put in place. It's interesting that Antonio's son is not the first son of the Duchess. She has another son that we don't hear about. And so would that raise problems about succession? Trying to re-establish a sense of a broken world and order. We see this at the end of Macbeth, with Malcolm's son being restored to the crown. We see it in King Lear, and we see it in a number of other plays in which there's that sense of the order trying to be restored. Now, whether it is restored is a question mark. Okay, what we've seen in this play, Webster has seen a society, a family, self-destruct, and are we convinced in this idea that succession will bring restoration of order? Again, to a Jacobean audience, the notion of succession is really important. The notion of a leader restoring order is very important. It's turbulent times, and maybe the play doesn't truly answer the question.